Hey everybody, what is up? Welcome back to Final Trade. It's been a little while since I've done one of these kind of financial theory kind of videos. And I had something on my mind that I've been thinking about a lot lately that I wanted to talk about. And it's this idea of intrinsic value. And so you see it a lot with discussions recently about Bitcoin. Does Bitcoin have intrinsic value? And if not, what does? And generally, this intrinsic value argument will fall into three broad categories. Um, the first is something has intrinsic value if it's physical and you can hold it in your hands, like gold. And so the claim is you can't hold Bitcoin in your hand because it's a digital asset, therefore it has no intrinsic value, but gold does because you can. And then also, generally, people will, in the same breath, talk about stocks and say, well, stocks represent a partial ownership of a company, and so it has intrinsic value. And that one's really odd because um, let's say you talk about Ford stock, and Ford owns a bunch of factories and owns a bunch of cars that are in progress of being built and a bunch of built inventory. It owns a bunch of the debt from people who have borrowed money to buy Fords, and those represent future cash flows. And so it has all of these assets, but there is no office in Dearborn, Michigan you can walk into and present your Ford stock certificate and just say, I'm here to pick up my new blinker bulb in exchange for the stock certificate. So you have no claim on that. And even if Ford were to go bankrupt, in bankruptcy court, the common shareholders of stock are near the back of the line for getting satisfied. And so you're probably there's probably no physical thing you can ever actually get for that Ford stock. You can only sell it for cash. So really, just holding something in your hand doesn't really make it real. It doesn't give it intrinsic value. The other thing is those stocks that you think you own, you don't really kind of technically own them. So let's say you have an account with TD Ameritrade, and it says you have 1,000 shares of IBM stock. Really, TD Ameritrade kind of owns those shares, and they just kind of say, we promise to let you tell us what to do with these. And there is a process you can go through to register those shares to you instead of them being registered to TD Ameritrade. And then you could actually request physical stock certificates. And then you could hold a real piece of paper in your hand and say, this has true intrinsic value now because I hold it in my hand. But really, I don't think any of that counts as intrinsic value. I mean, you live in a house. The house is physical. You can touch it with your hands, but what makes the house yours is the claim you have with the county that says this house is yours, and claims on various legal documents, titles, and such that say you do or do not own this house, or maybe you own a percentage of it, or something like that. And so the intrinsic value of something is not necessarily tied to its physical presence in the world. And I know there are many more examples of this I could make. I mean, I have a life insurance policy. And so I would say that life insurance policy has value. But there's nothing for me to physically touch because it is simply a promise, an agreement between me and a life insurance company that I will pay them every period. And if I die within some time frame, there will be a certain amount of payout. And so there's certainly value there, but there's nothing to physically touch. And so I don't think something having intrinsic value has to be tied to it being touchable in the real world. So the second common thing that people will argue is it has intrinsic value if it generates cash flows. Okay, well there's a lot of valuable things that don't generate cash flows. Um, Debt that doesn't pay a regular coupon is just one that I wrote down because that's something I thought of quickly. There's a lot of types of debt, bonds, and things that do not pay regular cash flows. They simply will pay back face value plus a bonus at the end of their period when they retire. So there's no cash flow involved, but we would say definitely that debt has value. And so another one is unsecured corporate debt because there is no physical thing behind it backing it up. It is explicitly unsecured. You have no claim. And so not only does there not exist the office for you to walk in and try to secure it, but um, you even in bankruptcy, you don't even have a place in line. And so, um, regardless of there being no claim to anything for unsecured corporate debt, we still have over $1 trillion global marketplace trading corporate debt. And so people apparently think this has value, even though by the definition of intrinsic value that some people use, it would be worthless. Okay. And so the third broad category that you see is that it sustains life. And so therefore it has intrinsic value. And this seems really kind of the weirdest because obviously we have all kinds of assets that don't sustain life, like gold. And yes, some people believe gold has intrinsic value and some don't. Um, and it's funny because often this argument will be made, well, in the form of, well, you can't eat Bitcoin or you can't eat gold or you can't eat whatever, as if that should be like the yardstick by which we measure value. And it's interesting because you could immediately think of things that you can eat that can sustain life that don't have value. And things like in the United States, for instance, the United States Department of Agriculture says that pig lungs aren't food. And yet, if you go to places in Europe, people will enjoy a haggis all day long. But in the US, when they butcher pigs commercially, the lungs are disposed of probably for fertilizer, if anything, where they have very, very, very little value, even though they can sustain life. So, these none of these definitions is really satisfying for what should have intrinsic value because for each one we can think of things that we know has value, that we know has a marketplace that trades them, that prices them, that clears. And yet people will tell us that something doesn't have value because it doesn't fit this more narrow definition. And I guess the thing is, if you have to resort to more and more convoluted and illogical definitions or examples to support an idea like intrinsic value, then maybe the idea itself is just junk. And that's where I stand on this. I think there is no such thing as intrinsic value. Nothing has value simply for existing. It has value in a market if someone will buy or sell, will transact in it, and if you can move the product to someone else. And the entire idea of intrinsic value is subjective, and I think it really helps when you get away from it because people who are caught up on intrinsic value will waste time trying to figure out why this is or why it isn't, and they will miss out on opportunities because they illogically convince themselves that something doesn't have intrinsic value based on their bad definition of intrinsic value. So let me know what your thoughts are about that. I'm really interested. I usually get some really good feedback on these kind of videos from people. I get some messages and have some discussions. So I'd like to see what you think about this. And certainly that my view on intrinsic value has evolved over time into where it is today. And I think some good arguments could maybe help it evolve some more. So let me know. If you like this kind of content, like, comment, share, and subscribe. Join me on Final Trade. Thanks a lot, everyone.